Welcome. My name is Mike Schut. I'm the program director at Farm Table Foundation. It's kind of a challenging conversation in a way to do something over Zoom on mindfulness. But we've been doing Zoom classes now since the pandemic hit, and it's been one way to stay connected to people, and we're grateful for that. So why don't we start off by if you could type in your chat box where you are joining us from. Okay, we've got River Falls, St. Paul, Seattle. All right, anyone else want to let folks know where you're from? St. Paul. The reason, folks, we have some Seattle people is I used to live in Seattle and have family and friends there. All right, well, first I wanted to start by acknowledging sort of the realities of life today. I certainly hope this finds you and your families doing well. I remember when I was sitting at my kitchen table, it must have been around March 16, sort of after we first started working from home, and thinking about how much had changed. And I saw a chickadee outside my window, and it occurred to me that for the chickadees and the sandhill cranes that had just returned to the fields outside my house, and the rhythm that the farmers were about to enter into in terms of planting their crops or putting something in their hoop house or feeding their animals and doing their chores, that there were rhythms that were still very much the same. And I found a fair amount of comfort in that, really. Someone else is getting in here. All right. And then, of course, this is also, so the comfort of the rhythms of the natural world have been important to me these days. And particularly, I guess I would say, when I am more mindful than not, that is particularly helpful for me. And then, of course, this is also an extraordinary time, and in some ways even a hopeful time for me in light of the protests that have been going on these last few weeks. And I've really wondered if there's a connection between the intensity and duration of the protests and the pandemic. I was writing a little bit about the pandemic earlier, and I was writing about that. I wonder if what we're getting here is practice, not practice primarily at social distancing or wearing a mask or washing our hands, as important those are, but like practice at doing something that might not be convenient for me, but it's important for all. So it's a practice of exercising the muscle of working for the common good. And what, in some ways, the protests on the streets are a recognition that it is in our common good that racism be more thoroughly addressed within our society. And perhaps the pandemic and the challenge that brought and brings has brought more awareness of the common good to our world. I mean, I think that's one possible, hopeful, not only way to look at it, but possibly a truth for our society. So that's another just acknowledgement of what's happening around us today. And I do feel that mindfulness connects us to these concerns, because I think mindfulness helps wake us up to what's going on in the moment and can help us see reality as it is, not as maybe others or our larger society sort of asks us to see it. So as most of you probably know, Farm Table Foundation works to build local food culture, and our purpose is to reconnect us to local food, local farmers, and the land. In a way, it's to help break what often is a pretty severed relationship between ourselves and our food, and the reality of what takes our food to get to us. So while our time today focuses on mindfulness, and a little bit more about Farm Table, we have a nonprofit restaurant. Hopefully some of you have been there. And and we also have an art gallery, and we now have a new exhibit there, so you can check it out if you want. You can't go in there with a bunch of people, but we would let you in if you come to the restaurant and have a moment. It's a great exhibit by Paul Oman, and there's something on our website about that. While our time today focuses on mindfulness, I thought I would begin by telling a story. It's a bit about my own story. But before I do that, I'm wondering if you all could type in if you're open to it and want to share your own spiritual or faith background. Whether it's a mindfulness practice or a spiritual community you're part of, a church you're part of. If you're open to sharing that, that would be interesting. Because I'm going to tell you a bit about my practice. And I'm getting a Westminster Presbyterian, okay. Kristen, are you able to hear now? I'm getting a note from Kristen that she can't hear. And since we're a small group, I'll just ask.
Yes, thank you.
Great. All right, so we've got a Presbyterian out there. I know some members of a Covenant Church are on here, of a United Church of Christ community, Catholic, but spend most of my time doing mindfulness meditation. Thank you for that. And yeah, I certainly want to acknowledge, well, as you'll find out, other folks here likely have more experience than I do with mindfulness, who knows? So, all right, well, thank you, Protestant denominations. So a bit about my story before we move into some mindfulness practice. One of my favorite authors is Frederick Buechner, or at least he used to be someone I read quite a bit. And he has a book called The Sacred Journey. And in it, it's a part of a trilogy of a memoir about his life. And at the beginning of it, he says, what I propose to do now is to try listening to my life as a whole for whatever of meaning of holiness. And he's a Christian, so he then says, of God, there is in it to hear. Whatever of meaning of holiness of God there is in it to hear. And he says, I don't do this, as some sort of navel-gazing exercise or sort of ego-caressing exercise, but in the hopes that the reader or listener will take out the scrapbook of his or her own life to find those pages of meaning of holiness there is in it to hear for that person. And indeed, mindfulness, I think, can bring us to a place of deeper listening. And and a good story, and Buechner's a great storyteller, a good story will, in its specificity and particularity, apply to the universal or help us connect our own lives to universal truths or things we might want to know about ourselves. And perhaps the most salient part of my story when it comes to mindfulness is that I don't have a regular mindfulness practice. In some ways, I feel like, in the classic way of taking certain, time every day to be quiet or to breathe, or to pay attention in a specific way. And I think that's actually partly because I went to Wheaton College, which is a very conservative evangelical school. And in some ways, I felt like what was really emphasized there is a certain way of being. And part of that way of being was, spending time every day praying and reading the Bible and being very disciplined. And I did it. But there you go. It's like an achievement. And of course, mindfulness is not an achievement. And it was more like a discipline that ended up feeling pretty spirit draining to me. And so I was part of a community for a while, where we did have a commitment to spend time every day in quiet. And so during those few years, I did have a regular practice, but I'd say since college, the majority of my life, I haven't had a specific practice, partly because I feel like it puts me back in a place that I don't want to be, which is one that reminds me of the Wheaton milieu quite a bit. But I've flirted with mindfulness and meditation and silence throughout my life, I guess you could say. And in some ways, to me, mindfulness has been part of or paying attention has been part of what's drawn me into this work, the work that I've been in, which in many ways I would say has been motivated by a desire to help heal what I see as a broken connection between ourselves and the rest of the natural world. And that Farm Table's mission certainly fits into that, though not in an overtly spiritual way. Although much of my career has been working with faith communities. And for me, moments of mindfulness and grace have often been associated with either, close times with a community of people, or being outside, maybe in my garden, or backpacking or hiking. And I wanted to share a couple brief stories about that. One was actually happened when I went to New York, the New York Museum, American Museum of Natural History. And if you've been there, there's a huge hall there called the Hall of Biodiversity. And as you walk into this huge hall, on the right side, and it's maybe 100 feet long and 30 feet tall, this wall of that with videos and pictures and reproductions of the diversity of life on Earth, from the simplest unicellular organism to the largest of animals and plants. So there's this beautiful display of life. And then down the center of this large hall is a reproduction of a tropical rainforest as best you can inside. So you walk down this tropical rainforest, and of course, rainforests are the most diverse ecosystems on Earth. And so you hear and have a smell and have a sense of the richness of life. And then you come out of that rainforest, and down the other side of this hall are stations essentially depicting the fact that we're losing species at a rate not seen since the disappearance of the dinosaurs. There's a book out called The Sixth Extinction. We're actually, in the history of time, there have been 5 great extinctions. The last one being the disappearance of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. And actually, if history books are written millions of years from now, they'll say right now is the 6th greatest extinction event. It's at that level is what I'm trying to say, that we're losing species at a rate that's that significant that will go down in the history books as, oh yeah, when the dinosaurs went, and when there was a previous one, I can't remember what caused it, when 95% of life died. So, and after reading that, I went out and sat in Central Park and I found a boulder on a kind of at the side of a little pond and just wept for what's being lost. And to me, that's a sign of something that I needed to follow with my life. Like that, how deeply that touched me required at least some awareness and openness, and then desire to follow in my career what that was calling me to, I guess is what I'm saying. And I've had similar experiences in a way with aspen trees, with wolves, with homeless men. And in a sense, I think the commonality in those experiences, and I think mindfulness can help us with have those experiences, is that my sense of boundary between myself and you, or myself and the other, really dropped. Or, I think we often experience ourselves as fairly separate, as skin encapsulated egos walking through this external world. But I wonder if the deeper reality is that we're actually deeply connected one to another, and let us not forget one to other species, and one to the world, ourselves to the world. And I think that mindfulness can help us be aware of and potentially experience that kind of reality more often than if we were not walking through the world mindfully. Because certainly, I don't know, almost all other messages you would get from our culture would be that you are an individual ego. And what Bill McKibben has this book where he wrote a book based on watching at the time there was the largest cable channel network in the country, and he had friends videotape all these shows, and he spent a year watching that 24 hours of TV that came across that one cable network. And he said if you had to boil it all down, the one message of the 24 hours of cable TV that came across that largest cable network, it would be that you are the most important thing in the universe, and that things revolve around you. Like that would be the message that you would be getting. It's a pretty different message than one that would say that we are deeply connected and that all of our spiritual traditions would support that. And then the other, E.O. Wilson is one of this last centuries. He's like 85 now. He's a Harvard ecologist. He loves ants. He's totally into ants. But he's become quite a philosopher, sort of intellectual leader in our culture. And he's got a book called, well, I don't know if he has a book, but a concept called biophilia, the love of life, biophilia. And, it's his contention after studying life through ants and then other beings, other species as well, and teaching biology all these years in ecology, that there's something in us that's hardwired, if you will, to use a technical term or a technological term, hardwired to love life, to be in relationship with life. So if that's true, and yet we walk around often feeling disconnected, and we walk around hearing things like what's happening because of climate change and species loss, then it seems to me we're walking around at some level with a fair amount of underlying grief, or else we're in denial a lot about what's really happening. And I found that experience, for example, that I described to you in the museum, as well as the concept of biophilia, particularly important as I seek to practice being mindful, because I feel like those things are supported by mindfulness, if you will. And it seems to me that in a way, this is where mindfulness also intersects with Farm Table's mission. Our mission is to build local food culture, to reconnect us to farmers and local food in the land. And in a sense, we need to become more mindful of the damage that's being done through dominant agricultural practices today. The modern industrial food system does wreak a lot of havoc on the land. And the kinds of farmers we seek to support are seeking to be really aware of the connections that I've been speaking about, so that biodiversity is increased on their land, so that water and soil are protected through their farming practices. We need to become more aware of Wendell Berry's statement, how we eat determines to a considerable extent how the world is used. And as so often the case, you can unpack a sentence of Wendell Berry's and then you don't need to do anything else, because he says it all so well. How we eat determines to a considerable extent how the world is used. And the truth of that would be seen if you look at land use practices and what's driving land use, it often is agricultural practices. So a demand for cheap beef contributes to cutting down the rainforests and the loss of topsoil in those rainforests, the loss of species, and the increased contributions to carbon dioxide because those trees are not absorbing the carbon from the air. Or you can just simply look at where the subsidies in modern agriculture go to see what's happening, what that system leans toward. And it seems to me that in that mindfulness of those things, we can then have options of living and acting in different ways. So before leading at least a brief practice of mindfulness, I guess if you want to turn your video on, if you're open to doing that, or else put in the chat box something you'd like to say. If you have anything you'd like to say about anything I've mentioned or your own practice, or you could raise your hand and I could call on you and unmute you too. So if anyone has something they'd like to say. The challenge with this, of course, is if we all start speaking at once, it'll be challenging. But so if someone wants to type in the box that you'd like to say something, or else raise your hand if your video's on, and I can call on you and unmute you. Does anyone have something they'd like to share?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
So the statement, how we eat determines to a considerable extent. I'm taking notes, that's why.
Yeah, Marilyn, it's a great quote. It's Wendell Berry's quote, how
Okay.
we eat determines to a considerable extent how the
Yeah.
world is used.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's really good. Thank you.
Yeah. And Barry has a lot of good writings on this topic. And one of my other favorites is about the sacramentality of food. That, I could find it potentially in a little while, but it's about how, we can eat ignorantly, clumsily, destructively, or we can eat knowledgeably, and with care. And it goes on to say that in eating that way, we're actually kind of practicing the sacramentality of food, if you will. So why don't you get comfortable? You can turn your video off if you'd rather during this time as I lead you through this, or leave it on, either way. But I'm going to guide you through a meditation and kind of body awareness, and then we'll come back together to talk about that a little bit. And we also, if you did bring a poem or something you'd like to share with the group, we likely can do that as well. So John Kabat-Zinn says that mindfulness is awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose, in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So why don't you get comfortable? If you're in a chair, maybe your feet are on the ground. You could potentially lay down too, I suppose, although falling asleep's always a possibility there. But if you can get comfortable and start with your breath, and just pay attention to the fact that you're breathing. To your inhalation and your exhalation. You can even feel the air coming in and out of your mouth or your nose and literally filling up your lungs. And of course, you can always come back to that, whether in everyday life or today as we go through this mindfulness exercise. And of course, as you're aware of your breath, other thoughts will certainly come to you. One of the ways I find thoughts helpful, dealing with thoughts, is like imagining I'm on the side of a river, sitting at the side of a river, and a thought is on a boat and it's floating by, but I don't have to hop on that boat with that thought. I can just, there's that thought, it's floating away, and I can come back to my breath. So now, as you're aware of your breath, also do a brief, gentle body scan, and start with the crown of your head. And be aware of any sensations there. Maybe you want to clench your jaw and close your eyes tightly and then let that go. Often I find I carry tension in my jaw or in my forehead. So letting go of those spots where you might have some tension, or just being aware of what's there, and then down into your neck. And shoulders. Maybe you want to roll your shoulders or try and drop your shoulders if you're holding them up, perhaps. So you can let go of that. And then check out your arms and fingers. Some of us carry tension in our forearms from typing we do or repetitive work. And one thing you might find is that you can actually focus your breath on that spot that might be particularly tense for you, whether it's in your neck or your shoulders, and in a sense, breathe space into that spot. So maybe clench your fists and let that go, make a fist, let it go. And now, some deep breaths into your chest, your torso. And awareness of that part of your body, as well as your upper back and your lower back. And come back to your breath and moving down into your hips. Try and breathe out any tension you may have in your hips, your thighs, and hamstrings, your lower legs, your calves. And finally, your arches of your feet, your heels, your toes. So now, as we've gone through a brief body scan, if there's a place that could use a little relaxation or breathing into it, why don't you do that for a moment? So now let's take a guided walk through one of your favorite spots. And those of you who are gardeners, maybe there's a spot in your garden or where you actually might want to sit there. Or if you're a canoeer or hiker or have a spot along a river. So be aware of let's say, walking into that spot first, whether it's a little gateway into your garden or as you approach your favorite spot on the river, wherever it may be. So simply an awareness of what's around you as you approach your spot. And then have a seat there. What is it that you see? What is it that you hear? I actually hear birds right outside my door right now. And what is it that you smell and feel? So be aware of all your senses as you sit in your spot with your relaxed body. And as you're sitting there, I'd like to suggest that you invite someone to come sit down beside you. And kind of inspired by Marilyn's story, let's say it's someone, maybe you don't really know them well. Maybe it's a person from a different culture, different tradition. And invite them to sit down beside you. And take a little time to gently show them what you see and feel and hear and smell. And you can always come back to your breath as you show your guest your place. Share your delight with them. And then maybe ask your partner if there's anything they see that they want to show you. And now, while you're both sitting there, I'll read you a poem or two. This is Mary Oliver's Wild Geese. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. And as you're sitting there, in a way you are experiencing, interacting with that family of things, some of those family members, including this new person you invited to share the space with. As Marilyn said, the homeless man they befriended became part of their family. One more poem about the family of things, in a way, by Wendell Berry. When despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free. So now maybe you could thank your invited guest for joining you, and perhaps say goodbye. Maybe you'll join them again. And then maybe slowly kind of bring your awareness back to your breath, if it's elsewhere at the moment. And then you can open your eyes and come back to the group when you're ready. If you want to turn your video back on. And I do think that those authentic relationships with quote unquote the other are potentially the most transformative relationships we can have. Or, you know, just imagine if we, I mean, and my mom and dad raised us in a pretty special place in Vermont where a lot of the people around us in the community we lived were mentally ill, struggled with serious mental illness. And as a young boy anyway, I don't remember thinking that person's, you know, that's person's not well, this person is. Maybe I would have if I had been older when I left there. I was 8 when I left, and my sisters were 10 and 5. But nonetheless, I think it was a place from which one can then go into life and realize that we are more alike than different, and that Marilyn, your experience with Rick was obviously very powerful and transformative. And in a way, I think what our responsibility is, if you will, we can't create a certain relationship or create a certain feeling, but maybe it's our responsibility to at least put ourselves in places where those relationships can be formed. I mean, that's something we can do. We can volunteer at a certain place. We can seek to help. Like for me, when I got out of college, I went and worked and lived with homeless men for a year. Or in some ways, wilderness experiences, while they're a privilege, they also are like it's a way to also then be open to relationships with the other. So thanks for sharing your story about Rick, Marilyn, and what that reminds me of in a way is this relationship, authentic relationship with others is what can transform us. And also then when we're able to put ourselves in the shoes of another, a little bit anyway, it's much more likely we're going to care for their world as well, not only our own. Anybody else like to unmute themselves and share anything that's about your experience as you were meditating, or something you learned from the person you invited into your meditation? Either. Or if you have a poem that you like, that you brought, I just suggested this yesterday in my email, but if you have something you'd like to share or read, please feel free to do that. I mean, I think it's really interesting that the 2 poems that I read, both authors, Wendell Berry, The Piece of Wild Things, and Mary Oliver's Wild Geese, in each case, they point to the beauty and integrity of other places, of other beings or other species, and as a place that they go to, or they invite us to go to. So Wendell Berry talks about going and laying down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds, how he comes into the peace of wild things. And Mary Oliver talks about the wild geese, and that no matter how lonely you are, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you harsh and exciting like the wild geese over and over announcing your place in the family of things. Both authors pointing to how we live in this family of things. Anyone else have something they'd like to share, a reading or a little about your experience at all? Or if you have something about your own mindfulness practice that you'd like to share with us that you find particularly powerful, it'd be interesting to hear that as well. And Vicky, welcome. I see you've just joined us. We've already gone through our meditation, so hopefully you can get something out of our conversation. And I found probably the main times in my life when I've had a consistent one, it's because I've agreed to do it kind of in concert with other people. So they're not that they're gonna, I mean, there's an accountability a little bit to that small group of people. And I know that they're doing it every day. So I was much more able to do it at that point with other people. I am kind of curious about the experience of inviting someone else into your space. If any of you would have something to share about how what the other person said or pointed out, or if there was anything that came out of that little wrinkle in the meditation.
Mike, can you say a little bit more about, and I think this is pairing with your dad's thought about the pairing of mindfulness with the opportunity for an authentic relationship?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, certainly mindfulness, I think, engenders or can help support, create humility. And sort of not trying to engineer something, but being with what is. And therefore, going into any situation, there's perhaps a better chance of both understanding your own, tendencies, vulnerabilities, things you bring to the situation. I mean, Kristen has been doing studying about social location lately, and of other people's social location and her own. And so you bring to the conversation more of an awareness of your own social location. I think mindfulness can help bring these things into your own conversations and interactions with others, which I think makes it more possible to be aware of your own, of what you might be bringing that might get in the way of authenticity, but also kind of helps you be more authentic yourself and maybe more vulnerable, you know? Because I think shared vulnerability is one of the things that helps break down barriers and can help things to feel authentic. Is if we share our own vulnerability, I think it allows other people to be a little more vulnerable as they grow in their trust of you. And I think to be vulnerable, you also have to, I mean, being vulnerable is also a sign of strength. And I think mindfulness actually can help a person see that vulnerability and openness is actually a strength. And I think the other piece that, I mean, one of the things I had thought about sharing is a kind of a meditation on identity that I have found really powerful in my life. And it's a meditation on, and it happens to be a meditation on when Jesus is tempted in the wilderness.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a way of viewing our own identity that I think can be really freeing. So that in a sense, mindfulness can, I think, help us feel a bit more rooted in our own identity. And therefore, like, let's say my dad tries to reach out to someone and gets rejected, or like, it's not maybe as challenging to his own identity because he's feeling he's okay in himself. So anyway, those are some thoughts about how mindfulness might contribute to an ability to develop authentic relationships.
Thank you. That was very good. And as you could maybe tell, I was taking notes. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I know I'm late to the ball game.
Okay.
Very late. I had a rough morning.
Okay.
And I'm on my iPad, so I'm not even sure how many people I'm joining. But I just wanted to say, in this moment in time, I know I missed most of this session, but I'm really almost, I'm very touched just about your conversation in general because of what's going on in our world right now, that I've wanted to get into meditation and mindfulness. I do it with my students in my classroom, but I've had a lot of deep thoughts really about myself as an educator and the conversations I could and should and maybe should have had with my students in the past about what's going on in our world, not just pandemic wise, but just with everything going on, George Floyd and everything else. But your conversation in the last 5 minutes has really filled my heart and sort of renewed a sense of the fact that it is okay for us to be vulnerable and to understand ourselves. That for me personally, I know that I could have, should have, and maybe am embarrassed about things I've done in the past, in a sense of maybe not addressing racial differences. Not anything horrible, just it just makes me reflect back. And so your conversation about being vulnerable with different ethnicities or through mindfulness is really encouraging to me. I wish I would have been able to join earlier in this session today. So I just wanted to say that. I don't know anybody else on here today other than you, Mike. I've joined a lot of the sessions through this pandemic, through baking and that sort of thing with Sylvia. And I've extremely appreciated that, because I've changed a variety in my life. But this session this portion of the session has really touched my heart.
Thanks a lot, Vicki. I'm really glad you could join us when you could. I'm glad that the conversation's been helpful and meaningful to you. You know, I will say that we did record this. So
Good.
I will send the recording out to all of you in case it's something you might want to review. So Vicki, you could tap into that if you like. And yeah, I think, Vicki, we did talk a little at the beginning about how, you know, wondering if the muscles being flexed in practicing safety for the common good related to the pandemic, you know, perhaps is one of the reasons that the response to Floyd's murder has been so strong and consistent and sustained.
That's true.
Because we've been practicing working for the common good these last few months. I mean, we've had to sacrifice in some ways, some much more than others, I know. But there has been some level of awareness that how I act in the world impacts other people in a very tangible way. And on a much more profound way, in a way. And this, what's our response to the George Floyd murder and others, I think is a reflection of awareness that, in this case, racism and combating racism is a profound act on behalf of the common good. And one of the things I'm hopeful about is that we got to practice that and are perhaps practicing that because of the pandemic. So it's a teachable moment for all of us in some ways. And I think your students, Vicki, are fortunate to have you. And so thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I continue personally myself going back and forth on trying to find the most appropriate or eloquent words in this time, and they're not there. And I feel like at some moment I will have those words to be able to express to whoever or my students. But what I've appreciated and noticed about myself through this is what I can take from others, and to be open to those conversations, or, and like I said, just a short 5 minutes worth of what you were talking about. I had no context to it, but it touched my heart, and it renewed for me the fact that no matter where there are people in this world, in Wisconsin or in my area in Iowa or across the world, that there is reflection and there is acceptance and there is downright, I'm at a loss for a word, that people are realizing that this is not okay. It hasn't been in the past, but this is enough. And I really hold on to the fact that maybe that will be what changes things for us as we go forward. So that's encouraging to me as an educator of young minds, that plus, you know, all the way to my elderly parents, that there's a possibility of reflection and change for all of us. So I appreciate it, because my soul needed this today. So,
You know, stay in touch with Farm Table, farmtablefoundation.org. You all know how to get in hold of us, I think, because you're on this class, but we'll continue to offer classes in the future. Some will be along these lines. Of course, the majority of them are around cooking and scratch cooking and reconnecting people to local farmers and the land. But for me, there's a significant element of spirituality and that connects to that. And that's part of what I hope to continue to bring. Because I think in some ways, faith communities, people of faith, those who practice mindfulness, there's a certain, connecting those things adds a certain greater power to our ability to stand up for what is right. Whether it's seeking a more just food system, that more people have access to good food, some of which Farm Table seeks to do, or it's working to address racism in our culture. I wish you a good day, whatever it may bring you to mindfulness. Feel free to email me. It's programdirector@farmtablefoundation.org. Let me make sure that gets to you all. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for joining today. Have a good day.